Hey, what's up? It's your boy Rawk. Tonight, we're playing God. I've managed to get my hands on some prime specimen, the cream of the crop. And all that's left for me to do now is to become a proud member of the reanimation station. You heard me right. The entities in this box have been dead for decades. But when I'm done with them, let's just say our overpopulation problem won't be getting any better. I can already feel the power surging through my veins. I've already defeated a god. And now it's time to become one. With the press of this here button, I will have conquered death itself. And I'll have my own legion of undead henchmen. It's the perfect storm for me to rid the world of those who don't believe in a Pokepog Wii supremacy. This is a tale of video game projects that never ended up seeing the light of day. Projects that by all accounts were dead, buried, and forgotten. Until I came along. Video games are tricky buggers. I already know the answer is no, and I haven't even asked the question yet, but have you ever taken a minute to stop and watch a game's credits? There were people involved with this? The development of any given video game can be one of the most complex processes known to man. You need to think about the graphics, story, gameplay, progression, title. Okay, maybe not that one. And you need a team of experienced, talented people to tackle each one. Considering the fact that there's barely a day that goes by without multiple game releases, it stands to reason that some games don't make it out of the womb. Cancelled video games, a common beast in the industry, but one that developers try their best to hide. Nowadays, games aren't revealed to the public until the developers are certain that they'll actually release. And because of that, when was the last time you remember a notable game being cancelled? And when was the last time a game released that should have been cancelled? Last week! In the crevices of gaming's past, revealing games way before they were ready to be shown off was fairly standard practice. And because of that, when they had to be cancelled for one reason or another, the world knew about it. But a cancelled game? Now that's a perfect specimen for my latest project, World Domination. I haven't had time to be employed. I've been busy. By discussing each of the games that lie dormant in this very box, I can bring them back to life to do my bidding. And hopefully be finished in time for trick-or-treating. So, let's start this journey with temporary box art. Earthbound 64 was a planned sequel to Earthbound, and was initially developed and revealed as a 64DD game. The game was supposed to have 12 playable characters across 12 different chapters, but due to the 64DD massively failing at being successful, the project was moved over to a standard Nintendo 64 cartridge, and the chapters and playable characters were both cut to 9 to accommodate for the lesser storage capacity they now had to work with. The game's development took place mostly towards the end of the Nintendo 64's lifespan, and supposedly was taking resources away from development of the company's next system, the GameCube. So, sometime in 2000, the game was cancelled. There was some footage revealed of this game, and it showed off a ton of characters and environments, as well as the game's 3D style, a first for the series. And while it definitely seems like it was going to be a pretty large-scale game, I don't know if I buy that it was taking away resources from the GameCube. I think the more likely explanation is either that there was something going on with the game internally that made finishing it impossible, or the N64 didn't have enough life left in it to warrant finishing it and localizing it for a worldwide release. Thankfully, the game was reworked for the Game Boy Advance as Mother 3, and we finally got a worldwide release. Never heard of anybody choosing trick instead of treat now, have you? Earthbound 64 isn't the only cancelled Earthbound game though. While the project was considered to be moved over to the GameCube before they settled on the Game Boy Advance, there was actually another GameCube Earthbound game briefly in the works. Very little is known about this game, including what it actually was. The game was pitched to Satoru Iwata and Shigesato Itoi by Yasuyuki Hon, director of the Baten Kaidos games, and he included some concept art in his pitch. All we can really learn from this is that the game would feature a felt-like art style, and would feature Ness and the Bag Lady, which led many to believe that this was a remake of either Earthbound or Earthbound Beginnings, rather than a wholly new title. The game ended up getting scrapped pretty soon after its pitch, mostly because the team was still putting all of their efforts into Mother 3 and ensuring that it was actually able to be a thing. But Shigesato Itoi was also reportedly freaked out by the proposal, so that also might have had something to do with it. Here's something you don't hear every day. The Virtual Boy. The Virtual Boy was not Nintendo's most successful system. It was actually their least successful system. There were plans for a lot of titles to come to the thing, but due to it selling so preposterously poorly, they were cancelled. The most notable of which being Virtual Boy Mario Kart. There is absolutely nothing known about this game. There's not a screenshot to be found. Hell, even the name isn't certain. The only time it was ever mentioned was in a German magazine in 2000. VB Mario Kart was listed as a racing game being developed by Nintendo, supposedly in development from 1995. It obviously never saw the light of day, and for good reason. Can you imagine the sorts of neck pain you'd get trying to play Mario Kart on this thing? But even if this game exists as a temp title and nothing more, I just find its existence incredibly interesting, especially considering that the Virtual Boy is one of only 3 Nintendo consoles to not receive a Mario Kart title in any capacity. You ever wonder what a prepubescent Kirby looked like? Well, you're not alone. DMA Design was so desperate to know what Kirby was up to in his preteens that they almost released an entire game about it. Kid Kirby was a Super Nintendo game being developed by DMA Design. For those unaware, DMA Design became Rockstar North. Rockstar North made Grand Theft Auto. They shared a dev team. It's unknown what the gameplay was going to be like, but the basic premise was that this was a Kirby origin story, featuring a younger Kirby with a funky swirl of hair, and euthanized versions of Kirby's cast, with highlights such as Prince DDD. Assisted suicide? Or poor understanding of English? You judging. Kirby isn't unfamiliar with the concept of a cancelled game, the most notorious example being the Kirby project that ultimately ended up becoming Kirby's Adventure Wii. There were 2 games used as sacrificial lambs to let this project come to fruition, the first of which was an isometric 3D Kirby game, a concept that the series wouldn't explore again until 2022 with Kirby and the Forgotten Land. The second game, however, was another 2D side-scroller, but it featured a lot of elements not present in the game we eventually got. These are obviously 2 completely separate beasts. Looking at the only available footage for this cancelled project makes that blindingly clear, and I honestly think it's a shame that this style was never used again. But it's nowhere near as much of a shame as the concepts present in Super Mario 64 2 never seeing the light of day. I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that Super Mario 64 2 was a planned sequel for Mario 64, and was another victim of the 64DD's failure. The game was to utilise the 2-player co-op feature originally present during the development of the first game, but with the additional space and power the 64DD afforded them, they would be able to make that dream a reality. The game was supposedly also to feature rideable Yoshi, and was to be a direct sequel to the first game, presumably following up its narrative directly, somehow. And yes, we have had multiplayer Mario games since then. Multiplayer 3D Mario games, nonetheless. But we have never had a multiplayer Mario game that features levels in the style of Mario 64's. 3D World's levels are entirely linear affairs, with not much in the realm of exploratory areas. And the games that feature level designs more akin to that if they have multiplayer at all, it's just a little sibling mode where you play as a glorified pointer. I don't know if multiplayer like what 64.2 would have featured is plausible, or even possible. If it was something Nintendo could do, I have to imagine that they would have by now, but even if it isn't, I would love to see what it would have turned out like, especially if it was in the form of a Mario 64 sequel. But what if it was in the form of a Diddy Kong Racing sequel instead? Donkey Kong Racing was a sequel to Diddy Kong Racing, being developed for the Nintendo GameCube by Rareware. The game was announced at E3 2001, with a fully animated trailer showing off the core concepts at play here. This was obviously a racing game, taking place in locations that look ripped right out of the Donkey Kong Country trilogy on SNES. But instead of riding carts, all of the characters are shown riding animal buddies from the series, namely Rambi and On Guard, as well as Zingers, which is pretty interesting. This project seemed to have a lot of potential, not just as a follow-up to the ever-beloved Diddy Kong Racing, but as a game in its own right. But after Rareware was acquired by Microsoft the next year in 2002, they had to cancel the project, as they were no longer allowed to work on games for any of Nintendo's home consoles. The game was reworked into the Project Saberman Stampede for the Xbox 360, but due to their lack of experience with the hardware and a general lack of direction with the project, Rareware ended up cancelling this game too. But this story does have a happy ending. Donkey Kong Racing never saw the light of day, sure, but we did eventually get a Donkey Kong Racing game in the form of Donkey Kong Jet Race. Happy Halloween! Donkey Kong Racing was one of many Rareware projects that were abandoned during the Microsoft acquisition, but they had examples of cancelled games before that. Most notably, Project Dream. I think this game is best known for ultimately becoming Banjo-Kazooie, but after looking at what we might have gotten from this game, I still think it's an interesting one to discuss. Dream Land of the Giants, as it was formerly known as, was an RPG that originally began development for the Super Nintendo. The game was to feature an isometric view and a fairy tale theme, as well as a group of pirates that aimed to capture our protagonist Edson. The game would eventually move over to the Nintendo 64, and the pirate themes the SNES version lightly tapped on became much more prominent than the fairy tale theming in this version. Throughout its development on the Nintendo 64, the game's protagonist ended up changing twice. First to a rabbit, and then to a bear with a backpack that we would come to know as Banjo. The game was ultimately cancelled, as the studio believed that it was simply too ambitious. So the team took Banjo from the later prototypes and created the game we all know and love today. This is a rare example of a cancelled game, not just because it was made by Rare, but also because some of the team behind it created a mini-documentary surrounding this game and its development. All of the information we have on this game is pretty well documented by its creators, featuring footage of a lot of different builds of the game, which I think needs to become a much more common practice. Now, take that sentiment and apply it to Waluigi stomping on Mario's gut. Super Mario Spikers was a game by Next Level Games in development for the Wii around 2007. This was another Mario sports game, this time focusing mostly around volleyball, with a lot of wrestling elements in the mix too. There's a decent bit of material out there for this game. 2 logos, a few prototype Mario outfits, some stadiums, and, the reason the project was gutted, some test animations. Next Level Game pitched this game to Nintendo with all of this material, and upon watching the character animations they were given, Nintendo concluded that the game was far too violent compared to the rest of the Mario series. I mean, taking one look at this Yoshi fight, or the human rights violation Waluigi commits against Mario, it's pretty clear why they thought this, and the game was cancelled pretty soon after. This one stings quite a bit for me. As someone who has Mario Sports Mix written in as his sole beneficiary, I would love to have seen one of the sports from this game expanded into its very own game, not you. I also have a sneaking suspicion that this game may have contributed somewhat to the Mario Sports series' decline. Call me crazy, but this game began development in 2007. I don't think it's a coincidence that most of the Mario Sports games released after this point in time have been pretty bland and disappointing. Except for Mario Sports Mix, obviously. That game is exempt from criticism. If I ever have kids, they'll be safe in your hands. The final two corpses lurking in this box are very much two sides of the same coin. Two games from the same studio who were pitched around the same time, became public knowledge around the same time, and ultimately were cancelled around the same time. Retro Studios is one of Nintendo's best subsidiaries, but it's hard to argue that the frequency of their games has become pretty dire. Metroid Prime 3 in 2007, Donkey Kong Country Returns in 2010, Tropical Freeze in 2014, and then nothing. They remastered and re-released games, sure, but they really haven't had a lot going on for the Nintendo Switch's entire lifespan. But, as much as that is true, it seems there's a lot more at play here, as somewhere between 2005 and 2008, they were working on a Legend of Zelda spin-off about Sheik. This was to be a much darker take on the Zelda series, and would explore what happened to Sheik after Ocarina of Time's bad ending. It would explore the story of the creation of the Master Sword, and was to be released on the Nintendo Wii. Just looking at the concept art, this looked poised to be an exceptionally exciting spin-off for the series. But in 2021, some things came to light that make that seem a lot less plausible. According to Paul Tozor, former programmer who worked closely on this project, while the game was conceptually cool, it didn't play anything like a Zelda game, and he went as far as saying that the gameplay was comparable to Whack-A-Mole with a Wii remote. Tozor described the project as an experiment gone wrong, and while this is obviously disappointing to hear, the game being cancelled in 2008 was probably for the best. The concepts at play were far too cool to be jeopardized by lackluster gameplay. As much as I want to see what would have came from this game's story, I think this game was a lost cause. Around the same time, in 2006 to 2007, Retro Studios were also working on a game starring Boo from the Mario series. Codenamed Project Haunt, this game would have starred a young Boo, fresh out of Haunt University. The game was set to be released for the Nintendo DS, and judging by the concept art we got, it seems highly likely that the game would have made heavy use of the system's touchscreen to manipulate Boo in ways that would help traverse the game's landscapes. It's unclear what the game would have actually been about, and what sort of gameplay it would have featured, but either way, this is fascinating to me. Mario's foes are arguably the most interesting part of his universe, so to almost have gotten a game that entirely centers around one species of enemy would have been incredibly cool, and could potentially have opened the door for more Mario enemies to receive spin-offs. But alas, this and all of the other games in this box were cancelled, and I'll always find that disappointing. Obviously they were all cancelled for a reason, and if the developers didn't have faith in any of these projects, then it's probably for the best that they were put to rest. It means that we didn't get to play them at all, yes, but it also means that we didn't end up getting half-hearted versions of them either. And even if we'll never be able to play these games, I'll always find them absolutely fascinating. I'll continue to wonder what they could have been had they seen the light of day for a long, long time. And of course, when I say we'll never be able to play them, I mean you'll never be able to play them. These corpses are primed and ready. Discussing their past was all I needed for them to be ready for a revival. And now, the time has come. These games will rise from the grave and we'll conquer the world! And I'll finally be able to experience what humanity has been missing out on since these games were taken away from us. It's finally time for me to take over the world! Rise, my minions! Rise! Oops. So, I wasn't cut out to be a god after all. Well, that's a sobering reality.